Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
If the frame is too narrow, then there's all these other people who are not just excluded, but unaccounted for. That's a deeper level of exclusion.
If we want to create systems change, we've got to bring new people in who start to understand that, actually, we could in partnership support women and the Indigenous group, or women and the 2S LGBT group, because actually people exist in both of those spaces.
Let's be honest, too often efforts towards gender equity run on parallel tracks. Women initiatives on one side and trans and non-binary inclusion on the other, and very few bridges between them. But what if those bridges are exactly where the biggest breakthroughs are waiting? In this episode, we'll unpack how to build workplaces and communities that don't just accommodate women, trans and non-binary people, but actually become smarter, fairer, and more human for everyone. We'll talk about how gendered systems and spaces still miss the mark for both women and trans folks, the mindset shift leaders need to stop thinking in silos and start designing for shared benefit, real world examples of inclusive design in action. To help me unpack all of this, I'm joined by a very special guest, Erin Davis, who is an award-winning inclusion strategist, global speaker, and advocate for equity that benefits everyone. Erin, it's so good to have you here today. Welcome to Gender in Focus. How are you doing?
Well, thank you so much for having me here for this conversation. And, I am doing well. And I say that in part of reflecting on all the not only challenges that we faced in our day to day, but also celebrating the joy that we also get to experience every single day, and programming my brain to really focus in on those really, good news stories that really, I think, probably inspire you to continue doing the work that you do.
Absolutely. It's so important because there is so much that, still needs addressing. That's an understatement. And so that focus on the positive end of the equation is super important to keep our spirits up because there's quite a bit of work left to do. And speaking of which, I know we're talking about inclusion across the gender spectrum here today. And so I'm curious to hear from your experience working with other organizations where you've seen or noticed some patterns around the inclusion strategies that folks have. And typically, at least in my experience, I've seen a lot of siloing of initiatives. And I wonder if you see the same between women's equity efforts and trans and non-binary issues.
Yeah, I absolutely see this pattern. And then maybe within this, I'll share a story too about how, even for myself, it's become a refined conversation to really start to understand how do we make sure we are focused on inclusion, and through that work, understanding whose voices are either at the table or not at the table. And so when I started doing this work, it really was around who's missing in leadership. It was connected to my own work and not seeing anyone reflected that looked like me, who had similar experiences to myself. But I also didn't know a lot around the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was just my story. And so through my research and through my understanding and having conversations with others, that's when I started to deepen my understanding and really hold on to two words now in my practice. That's almost, I 15 years ago when I started this
Adding up
journey.
the years.
And yeah, exactly. A little bit of mental math there. And starting to unpack what does equity mean. So we're looking at systems and really understanding where the challenges lie there, but also getting to this place of inclusion and knowing that it can't just be my experience that leads this work. It's got to be a shared experience, and start to understand and see those those conversations. And it's interesting because I had a conversation with a very good friend of mine recently
Oh,
who
yeah.
is a disabled person,
Mm,
and she was saying, guess what? Disabled people are also in these different groups that we're
mm,
talking about, right? And when we
mhm.
sort of segregate identity, um, we can often think in a very binary way about that experience. And so even when we talk about women, and actually, you know what, Kai, this is such a good teachable moment.
Yeah.
I often and have been trained to say, well, those gains have been made for white women. Well,
Mm,
we can start to add on to that sentence, right? In that
absolutely.
conversation. And so, what gains have been made for trans women?
Mm,
And what gains have been made for disabled women? And we don't necessarily go into those different intersections to understand for Indigenous women, right? It's
mhm.
easy for our brains to put people into boxes. We sort of know that within the brain science. And so I have to work with organizations to really go, okay, that's a great entry point.
Yeah.
And and how can we do this work in concert? And if we don't,
Mm,
then we're solving for symptoms, not for systems, right?
mm,
And how do we get to a place that we actually are thinking about what does inclusion mean, and not just looking at an individual group in isolation, because that individual group, and I guess what I'm trying to say too, is is intersectional even if we aren't thinking that.
absolutely. That's so true. And it just becomes more not even superficial because of course those changes are important, but they're incomplete, right?
Mhm.
There's so much more to it, and that if the frame is too narrow, then there's all these other people who are not just excluded, but unaccounted for. That's a deeper level of exclusion that we may not recognize, and so certainly women, there's very important initiatives that need and changes that need to be made, but if we're not thinking about these other intersectional aspects of being a woman, then those unfortunately are incomplete and um, yeah, leave a lot of people behind, probably the majority actually, when you account for all those.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe another way for people to think about this and understand this is we share sort of this intersection as well. I worked in the engineering world for a number of years. And so we could say, what does an engineer look like? What does a firefighter look like? What does a
Mm,
doctor look like? What does an architect look like? What does a nurse look like? Right? We can ask these questions, and you and I will not have an answer to that because we have done the work,
sure.
to say could look like anyone.
Right.
Um, but society has trained us in a very
Mm,
specific way, what we see represented in film and media because we have so much exposure to that, what we witness in conversation and how people describe themselves within their own occupation may
mm,
paint a picture. We may have a reliable source, right? Maybe someone in our family is an engineer and then we think of them. So
right.
I think the encouragement is to say yes, and yes,
Mhm.
and I know this person and their story, and there's another story yet to uncover and to discover. And how do we make sure that we don't just sit in a singular way of looking at things because it doesn't serve us?
Yeah, absolutely. Not to the individuals who are not included in that frame, but also to wider society, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, what kinds of things are we missing out on when people aren't able to give their gifts to within the workplace, but of course, much more beyond that too, right? So, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it makes sense to have much broader frame. But appreciating that sometimes it's helpful to start somewhere, right? And then dig into that piece, and then expand, like you said, the and part. So, okay, we've got a handle on this part, maybe not solved it entirely, but we want to keep building upon that and perhaps extending a bit further or making it a bit more specific for a particular group, right? Like we've dealt with women's issues more broadly, but now let's add in, you know, women with disability. We're going to add in trans women. We're going to add in Indigenous, because of course there are specific needs for each of those subgroups of the broader, women's initiatives, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. That's fantastic. Have you seen in your work how organizations have started to kind of bring in these various threads and start to coalesce them, to unify them rather than dividing amongst folks in this way, particularly when it comes to women's issues and trans issues, or especially I'm thinking like, shared goals of safety and belonging, even opportunity, like you were saying, representation within, especially the leadership, but of course more broadly, especially certain industries have had more or less of particular genders.
Yeah, I have one particular story that always comes to mind. And I think when I think about the question, how are we getting people to shift from identity only framing
Mm,
to the specific conditions that we want to create? So, like you said, like, how are we thinking about those shared values?
mhm,
Because my guess, now we have to share space to validate, but my
right.
guess is that we probably do have shared values within safety, within
Mm,
belonging, within respect. And so those can be our anchors for the conversations that we then have and share that space with. But if we only understand from one perspective and then try to overlay that to everyone's
mm,
experience and expectations, we're going to miss the mark. So this
sure.
is why it's so important to share space together. The story I want to share, though, and this is pretty early days. This is probably back in 2016, 2017. So I want to give that context because and I suppose permission to folks that are listening and doing this work. You and I don't have a magic easy button.
What?
Do do
Just-
do this one thing. Although someone said to me once, they're like, "You should get that made. Like, you should
uh,
just get a little easy button." But then when people push it, it just like phones your phone number, and then you can help them solve these big complex problems that they have. I'm like, okay, well,
maybe.
maybe. But there isn't. That we have to understand the context of the organization. We have to understand the context of where they are even within their maturity of talking about
Mm,
inclusion in the workplace. And so once we have a little bit more of that framing, I think we can help to build the strategies. But the story I remember, 2016, 2017, is the organization I was working with had a women's employee resource group.
mhm,
And to be honest, there for sure was binary thinking in that because it was the first employee resource group. So we
mm,
can celebrate the idea, okay, we're giving space to employees to come together to talk about this issue.
mhm,
It was an organization where women were quite underrepresented. So it was an
mm,
identified gap that needed to be looked at and
mhm,
understood a little bit more. And the Women's ERG created safety in bringing folks together and then allowed this opportunity for at the time it was called the Pride ERG, but really the representation of 2S LGBT perspectives in the organization to
right.
do a joint conversation
Mm, wow.
because the folks that wanted to start the Pride ERG didn't feel safe. Some of them had the
Mm,
experience of like, oh, I'm going to have to come out at work again
mm,
because if they're sort of reaching a broader audience. And they wanted to do that with the safety of the group that the Women's ERG had created.
wow.
So I love that as an evolution of the conversation in saying, what can we do together in partnership? When we look at the work of employee resource groups, it can become very complex very quickly. And this is what a lot of organizations have done, right? They've created these almost
Mm,
silos of these different groups, and everyone has good intent,
yep.
but the impact of what they're doing may not have the broadest ripples if they aren't actually
Mm,
thinking about how could we do things together in partnership, because again, we have the shared values
yep.
and these are the conditions that we want to create. We want to create a more inclusive organization. What can we do together to do that? And I think that's
Mm,
where I see organizations who are really invested in creating an inclusive workspace are thinking about that and having the conversation of where are some natural intersections, because we do have to honor people's specific identities
Sure.
and create opportunities to bring new people into the conversation, because that's where I also see sometimes a bit of a gap is we
Mm.
may be having the same conversation with the same people. And
Oh
if we
yeah.
want to create systems change, we've got to bring new people in who start to understand that, oh, actually, we could in partnership support women
Hmm.
and the indigenous group, or women and the 2S LGBT group, because actually
Yeah.
people exist in both of those spaces.
Yeah, and then there's a greater sense of belonging and more understanding for whom this might be a relatively new topic, but they have some understanding from one aspect of that group, right? Oh,
Mhm.
that's such a good point. Yeah, we often talk about it as the kind of who to what trend shift. So definitely, of course,
Mm.
identity being an important factor. It's like who we are, and it's very deeply ingrained and embedded, right? So we do want to honor that, but there is this aspect of what are we striving for? What do we want to achieve? And so the being able to translate or to kind of cover both in essence is so critical so that both we can contribute to each other because there's really rich sharing across groups, and for the people for whom there is an intersectional experience, they can even integrate those things in like this very, I mean, within their being, number one, and then also to contribute to various initiatives and efforts, and to translate things too between groups, which sometimes requires a bit of extra effort for people to
Mhm.
actually understand if it's not their own experience. So all of that is possible if you create these opportunities of nexus, crossroads where people come together and can discuss or collaborate or inter-support in some way, right? Certainly discussions are an important part of that. But then there's also a lot of richness in strategy of how to design a washroom between, say, that can span both trans and people with disabilities needs, and then more
Mhm.
broadly beyond that, as just an example, right?
Mhm.
But that's a really great example, and erg is a huge way to move those things forward within organizations if set up properly in the way that you're describing, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there's always lessons and there's always ways to evolve and do things better. But if we have this employee voice
Mm,
that is enabled to have a direct line to senior leadership,
right.
then doesn't it make sense for us to have as many voices and perspectives as part of that group to
Mm,
create the change,
yeah.
right? It
Yeah.
just, so what we're doing now is pausing within the
Mm,
conversation to say, because I think we can get so excited about the change that we
mm,
want to see, the reason I shared my story is the change I originally wanted to see was more women in leadership that looked like me.
mm,
Now, I do still want to see that, but there is
sure.
a lot more people that I want to see represented in leadership now, because I continue to iterate, pause, think about whose voice is missing
Mm,
at the table and making sure that their lived experience is also represented. So that's what I now believe my work to be.
yeah.
And for organizations to start to think about that, 10 people is great, but 100, 1,000, all of a
Mm,
sudden, it's kind of that cliche saying, but I and I have not actually dove into where this came from,
okay.
but rising tides raise all boats. So
Right.
in this sort of analogy, is like, I believe by us working together, we actually get to this greater place.
Mhm. Oh yeah, it's so important that that happen, but it does require a broader strategy uh,
Hmm.
that can create that tide to rise, right?
Yes.
Rather than just looking at one or two boats and lifting those out. It's just like there's it's longer term work, but in the end, at least I think, and we'll see if this is the
Hmm.
case, is faster by encouraging those boats to rise. I wanted to make it a bit more tangible, as you've already provided some great insights and stories to make that concrete, especially with the ERGs, which so many are a part of. But I was wondering too, in terms of some of the systemic pieces. I know we were talking, and you've had some experience, or we're part of some conversations at the United Nations earlier this year, and we're talking about washrooms, and this tends to
Mm-hmm.
be a bit of a flashpoint when it comes to discussions. And I'm sure we've all consumed our share of media on this, or seen firsthand. And so I'm just curious what you heard or learned about at the United Nations when it comes to washroom design, and how to make that more inclusive, especially when we're thinking about, women and trans and non-binary folks.
Yeah. So I appreciate that we were having this story because it is a universal experience for
Hmm.
people to use the washroom. I'm saying that a little bit slower because I'm like, does
Is
that
it true?
include everyone? I
Yeah.
think it does.
Yeah.
But how people
Well,
need to go to the bathroom might be very different,
right. Like if you
based
have a
on their
catheter
ability.
or whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. But I say what a great entry point because we have shared experience in
Right.
that. And for context for listeners, I have had the ability to go, and so this is the Commission on the Status of Women at
Hmm.
the United Nations. And so in our very conversation, who are the women that we're talking about when we go to the United Nations, right? And so I shared this story with you because it really was the first time that I'd seen a side event focused on
Mm.
the trans experience.
Mm.
And so I wanted to go sit in the room and hear the conversation and give props to those organizers to say, like, yes, these are the intersectional conversations
Mm.
that we need to start to have, so folks understand. And so I think some of the highlights from a design perspective, and then I want to share a bit of a tangible um, opportunity for people to think about within their own day to day
Mm.
that they can think about. So, the story was around single stall, all gender washrooms
Mm.
were highlighted in their design because that supports women, caregivers with strollers or
Mm.
children.
Yeah.
How do we create that space where it may not just be a single user, so that that single stall, that door provides privacy for that caregiver who may have more things with them that
Mm.
they need to put somewhere. Um, Certainly supports trans and non-binary people
Mhm.
without harm or policing.
Mm.
Who's in that washroom, right? That privacy piece. It can support people with personal care attendants, and so
Mm.
that may not be my experience going to the washroom, but I do
Right.
have friends who do have care attendants, and so they do again need that space. And it can reduce line wait times because there's this efficiency benefit that comes from it. And that was a bit of the story that was shared. And this, so the United Nations session that I go to is in the United States in New York City. So I give that context because the example that was given was for folks to leave more Yelp reviews. And so
Mm.
for the listeners in Canada, I know maybe we don't utilize Yelp as much, but you'll appreciate the story. And so you go to a restaurant, just imagine you're going to a restaurant and you need to use the washroom,
Mm.
and there's two washrooms at the back of this very small and quaint restaurant. And I think many people may have this experience, and you go to the back and you look at the doors and you go, oh,
Mm.
these are gendered washrooms. And for
Mm.
me, this is quite often the case.
Right.
The women's washroom is locked. There's someone in there. It's been being used.
Mm.
But the washroom that's been assigned to men is open, and it's
Mhm.
a single stall
Yeah.
washroom with a
Yeah.
door, and just a toilet. And I go, huh, do I wait? Do I go in
Mm.
there? Do I answer the questions? All of these things go through my mind,
Sure.
where a simple solution, like in this particular circumstance,
Yeah.
both are just washrooms because that is the experience of what they are providing.
Yeah.
And the Yelp review comes in with a positive
Mm.
tone to it to say, I loved my experience at this restaurant. Really
Sure.
great food, whatever it is. Hopefully that's the case. But then I went to use the washroom and I had quite a wait time
Mm,
because the stalls were gendered. And this is a real opportunity to change your signage to make that customer experience even better. And I was
right.
like, oh,
Ooh,
wow.
well put. Well put.
Now we could also, share a little bit of the story, like, oh yeah, that was an annoyance for me, which is like unfortunately a bit of the case for folks. And the person on the panel sharing this story, this is the hard part. This is the hard part to hear these stories.
Right.
They took the train in from a surrounding area to get to New York City. They are a trans individual and they had to plan their day out thinking that they may not be able to use the washroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be another aha moment for folks to really start to think about, that when we don't think about inclusive design,
Mm-hmm.
we are putting people in a really vulnerable space, because that harm, that policing potentially comes into the equation. And to think, would you want to be in that circumstance? I
Mm-hmm.
don't think anybody wants to be in that circumstance.
Yeah.
And so we need to improve the experiences for all people. So
Mhm.
the caregivers, the folks that have maybe personal care attendants, those that just need their personal space when
Mm.
going to the washroom. That sounds like a really great idea to me.
Right?
Yeah.
That's such a good point that, the way that you design a washroom, even down to the signage, right? Especially if
Hmm.
you already have the space, right? That's most of the struggle and, the cost. And then it comes down to the signage, and we revert to things, we kind of do things how we've always done them. And so it can
Hmm.
revert to, we're gender specific a lot of the time in these types of spaces, without thinking about what are the downstream effects of this type of labeling. And then when people share, like on a Yelp review or even feedback via email, can often just ring a little bell for people to be like, oh, yeah, why do we do it that way? It seems
Hmm.
kind of archaic now. And we're creating all these kind of delays or challenges for folks, and that a pretty large number that kind of suffer in silence, whether it's, a person with disability or a trans person, or like yourself, just having to, wait in line, or the example that that person was providing. So it
Hmm.
kind of blows my mind sometimes. And a signage fix is pretty cheap, I would say, in the grand
Yeah. Yeah.
things.
Totally, totally. And you know this from the layered work, and like all spaces are not created equal, and sometimes there
Sure.
is some infrastructure changes that have to be considered. But in restaurants, it really, I do observe sort of just a lot of doors with handles, and you can lock them. And this is just the nature of the work that I'm in, but I
Mhm.
definitely know the washrooms where I'm located in Treaty 6 in Edmonton that
Uh-huh.
are inclusive. And I tell people about it because that is part of my work.
Yeah.
And the other part of this conversation that I just thought about is I actually celebrate and take pictures of washrooms that have menstrual products in them,
Yeah.
because again, that universal design is a shared experience for a lot of individuals.
Sure.
And why not have that universally available for the folks that need to use them, right? So that's
Absolutely.
again,
Yeah.
what are the users of this experience going to need? And 50% of the population, give or take,
Yeah.
at some point in their life is probably going to need that. And so
Mm.
this is incumbent upon folks that are creating and designing spaces to really think about that universal experience that you want people to have.
Mm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this has come up a few times. Like, I'm sharing about all the washrooms that I really enjoy in the city. I
Right.
think other people that are
Mm.
part of these different groups that we've talked about,
Yeah.
they're telling their friends about the positive experiences.
Oh,
So
for
you're
sure.
like
Yeah.
getting return clientele to your space when you are
Yes.
more inclusive.
Yeah, yeah. There's definite
Yeah.
benefits to everyone, right? Including an economic one, right? From a business perspective. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of knowledge sharing among whether it's kind of ad hoc of like, don't go there or go here
Mm,
type of exchange, or sometimes there can be apps. I know certainly with people with disability, they
right.
have various apps. So do trans and non-binary folks, especially non-binary folks have a really hard time finding anything other than a men's or women's facility, which both going into them could present their own unique challenges because we often assume what somebody's space, whether somebody is quote in the wrong place based on how they look,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
Feminine or masculine. So that presents a challenge. And so just needing to know where the all gender spaces are, whether they be single unit or multi stall. And so that is, it's a little bit more regional. It's not every area has that mapped in any way, but where there's an exchange of user information. But this could all be solved if organizations had a more of a view to solving this in a universal way so that people don't have to create these things that are essentially workarounds rather than solutions, right? So
Yeah, totally.
yeah. So that's a fantastic story, and certainly so many people benefit from single unit washrooms, and if they're properly labeled to be for anyone, then that so much the better. And we have started to highlight, oftentimes, given we're trans focused, we are literally focused on trans folks, but we have started to broaden those statements of benefit because, of course, it's not just trans and non-binary folks, and there's actually much more of a majority, especially if we think about some of the ones that you've listed, but even people with IBS or Crohn's,
Hmm.
who just need a little time and space and privacy to themselves because it's a lot to have to handle that with other people around and listening.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that actually, and
Mm,
I will make maybe a statement that includes even more people, but I know a lot of people do have that ailment.
mm,
I don't know, sometimes we just need some privacy and
right.
quiet time, right? Like all the introverts in the world, that's not
Oh,
me. But even
that's true.
I get overstimulated in
Yeah.
certain spaces, and when
Uh-huh.
I go into the washroom, it's just a little bit about it's just going to take a little deep breath right now
Yeah.
and reset.
Yeah.
Great. I know where all those washrooms are too.
It's it's so true. We did a survey of 3,000 facility users at a university, and I was shocked how much happens in washrooms beyond just
Mm,
relieving oneself or taking care of some medical need or another. Um, the emotional piece was a huge theme across the gender spectrum. People are struggling at work, and there's no place to really privately handle those difficult emotions. And washrooms are one of them. And
yeah.
maybe not the most ideal because there's so much else happening there, but it is really valuable space, and that's tremendously important for probably, I would say, most people at that point,
Hmm.
right? Not just a half of them.
Totally.
So
Hmm.
one other thing I wanted to get into because it does come up is single unit washrooms. The main reason why or that I hear from folks when we have these types of conversations is the alleged difference, and it might not be that alleged, uh, of cleanliness between
Mm,
genders. And so some people feeling very strongly about wanting a cleaner space. Yeah, have you heard anything about that, or what are your thoughts on the cleanliness factor? As a way to say we should keep them separated.
oh, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I
Okay.
I definitely do have people
Mhm.
share, and I would say it's a legit experience that they've had where the um the male washroom
Mhm.
is gross.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot to unpack in there, and
Sure.
again, this is a particular like washroom that someone's referencing,
Mhm.
but I would question the workplace culture.
Mm,
Why are we allowing that space to be uncleanly
Right.
And this is usually on work sites that I hear more of those examples given.
Right.
Well, there's pretty strong standards in other parts of your work that it needs to be clean and tidy so
Mm,
you can effectively do your job.
yeah. Or
So I
safety.
would
Yeah.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
and those are, yeah, you're right. Like there are specific safety standards associated with that.
Mm,
So why should the washer be treated any differently? So that would be my angle
yeah.
and like response to that. My thoughts on this, because it came up in conversation the other day, and
Yeah.
I had to laugh and kind of shrug my
Sure.
shoulders a little bit because I have a home office now, so I don't work in an office environment.
Mhm.
But people were talking about how uncleanly the kitchen was,
Mm,
and dishes in the sink, and people thinking someone else is going to put
mm.
their plate away. Do we need two separate kitchens, Kai?
Oh, now we're adding another layer to the no. Yeah, I get your point. It's like, yeah, we just need to level up in general in
Hmm.
the office, and that everyone is going to contribute to that to make that possible. Because you're right, duplicating everything is quite ridiculous and costly.
Yeah. Right? So let's like flip the script on this, because
Yeah,
I hope everyone would be like, no, we do not need two kitchens. Maybe jokingly, someone might say that we do, but
yeah.
like that's a redundancy that I don't think is necessary. So
Mm,
when we're talking about this from a washroom experience,
mhm.
come on, like
Yeah,
let's make sure that we are taking care of the space that we
right.
use. And I think that that is incumbent upon all of us as users of those spaces
Yeah,
to make sure that we are taking care of them.
yeah. Doing our part.
Hmm.
Another thing I added into the mix is just making sure, you know, while that might be the case and is sometimes, there are
Hmm.
cleanliness challenges on all sides, I would say. Another factor is that we kind of over focus on men being uncleanly, and that is widely shared across the gender spectrum. Like there can be various people of different genders who are uncleanly, and there are also examples of people who are cleanly. And then
Hmm.
just rather than getting into that hamster wheel, it's just being like, no, our standard is this, and we're all going to contribute, and you know, we can do it. And here we go.
Yes, we can.
So I think that's really important. But it is important to kind of pause for a beat in anything that kind of blocks some forward movement, right? So there are things that come in the way of a change. And so to pause and take a look at it and then carry on with the change of updating the signage so it doesn't have, you know, two gender. Another thing is not just to have the singular gender, but also not to have two icons. Sometimes think that represents everyone, but it doesn't. So we generally
Hmm.
tend to recommend just a toilet icon and everyone welcome, and then call it a day. To
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I get your point too, because I think sometimes people try to be really cute. Like I think that's their
mm,
intent, but then it just causes confusion,
yeah,
really, at the end of the day. And you can be cute in other parts of your establishment.
true, true. Yeah,
Yeah.
there are other opportunities. Absolutely. Yeah, I wondered if there were any other kind of shifting beyond washrooms, if there's any other examples that you've heard of or that you've been, a part of in terms of, yeah, thinking about integrating women's and trans inclusion results into kind of a smarter, more human-centered design.
Yeah. A couple other stories come up, and I'll share another employee resource group related conversation. The organization I worked at previously, we sort of asked the question, are our benefits inclusive? Which
Mm,
for an organization with, tens of thousands of employees, that's a pretty big question to say
sure.
yes or no to. And in conversation with the benefits department, the answer was yes, and they work with the specific provider of those benefits to have the conversations to understand, I would assume, the intersections. And it was a fairly positive
Mm,
response that the team and I got around saying yes, we are with a very well known benefit provider. They are looking at benefits through a lens of inclusion, but I wasn't quite satisfied with the answer
Mm,
because I don't have the lived experience of every identity. And so
right.
what we did is we actually utilized one of the employee resource groups, specifically the Pride employee resource group, to say, hey, would you take on this project that actually has specific business outcomes,
Okay.
not just, fun flags and food, which we can sometimes get stuck in when we do employee resource group things.
Mm-hmm.
But can you actually, validate this statement that our benefits are really inclusive? And so I sort of think about, well, if we'd asked the women's ERG, how would they answer? If we asked, the indigenous ERG, how
Right.
how would they answer? And so we tried to do this sort of joint project to look at it. And I'm sure people are going to guess where the story is going.
Mm,
There are some additional opportunities for inclusion within
mm,
the benefits package,
excellent.
right?
How exciting.
And some of them were kind of simple in terms of like, what are the images that you are using to convey what a
Mm,
family looks like,
mm,
and where there's some stereotypes presented in there. But there were some opportunities for specific benefits being provided to employees that were added through this project. And so
mm,
I think it's incumbent upon us to, again, what are those additional layers when we ask the question, what does inclusion look like?
right.
We could have easily said yes, because the experience for women, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe thinking that in a very narrow definition, is really inclusive, and
Right.
most of the folks on the benefit team actually were women, but we decided to take it to a more nuanced level and really start to ask some more pointed questions.
Mm,
And I think this comes up too from an accessibility perspective, where we talk to folks who are disabled, and if you pick up the phone and say, like, is this place accessible,
mm-hmm.
the answer is yeah, yes it is. And then you get there and you're like, oh, actually, no, it's not.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think, you know um, people are part of the trans community may also be disabled. And so
Mm,
where do we ask these sort of multiple questions to really get to, are we moving towards inclusion? So I think that
mm,
that example is relatable in terms of ensuring that we're asking not just one question, but we're asking multiple questions, and we're sort of
mm,
thinking about it from different lenses.
yeah.
And then from a personal perspective, and then we'll get into if there's any other intersections here. Context for the listeners: this is a very Canadian example, and oh no, I have another example I'm going to share with you. So, recently we
Uh,
have gone through a new fiscal budget for our federal government,
yeah.
and there were conversations coming up around wage funding
Mm,
being reduced. So that's women and gender economy department. And I think that sometimes our default in sort of the definition of wage just thinks about women in a very singular way.
right.
And there's an organization called Momentum Canada that really positioned some really amazing work.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the email up in front of me because I wanted to sort of like give pause to how great this was. I was one of the 175 organizations that signed that particular petition to say we need to actually think about this. And I thought it was actually so great that it was coming
Mm,
from a 2S LGBT group that said we are looking to main funding for these groups and women's
mm,
equality because we are part of this work in a big way.
mm,
And so the great news about this, and for context, it was worrying about like 80% cut to this
yeah.
funding. So it would be like sort of devastating to a community that like doesn't get enough funding to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But this advocacy came out the other side really positively. We saw
Mm,
huge investments, relatively speaking,
mm,
to this work. And so I think that that's, for me personally, just thinking about how am I making sure that the systems that are looking to create change are supported and funded in the right way. And I see those
mm,
intersections of the work being done specifically for the 2S LGBT community, but also saying like this is part of the women's work that
Yeah.
we are doing, and jointly together we are together, we can actually make a huge difference. So that was like kind of a real time example that just happened recently that I thought was so great.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so exciting and so relieving too, as it can
Mhm.
go in many different directions, especially with examples from elsewhere. And
Yeah.
so, you just have that moment of hoping and also needing to push and come together in those moments, like you said, and sign petitions or, have conversations so people are aware these are interconnected issues. They need to be funded and in order to be able to advance anything, especially in areas where maybe there's not as much research or not as much knowledge. And so, yeah, that's so exciting. I was watching that very closely and very
Mhm.
excited when the news came that there is funding to be continued.
Yeah.
So uh, that's exciting. The ERG example is a really good one. To kind of echo what we were just talking about with in terms of momentum, highlighting those interdependencies or interconnectedness. Uh, with benefits, I find it really interesting. Certainly, there's gender affirming benefits that are typically now being considered or are being actively added into the extended healthcare benefits of many organizations. Insurance companies are, it's on their radar or they've actively assembled something. But I find it interesting, and this is where perhaps a more interconnected model might work better. Where, yes, it's great and it's really important. So I don't want to ever say this is not me disparaging gender affirming benefits. But to me, gender affirming benefits is for everyone, or ideally,
Mhm.
because right now,
Yep.
perhaps for some listeners might not be aware, there are diagnoses there's like particular requirements to access gender affirming benefits that then just limits them to trans and non-binary folks. But of course, we know that cisgender folks also have gender affirming care benefit needs, right?
Mhm.
Hormone therapies at different lifespans. Even laser hair removal for some cisgender women is a
Mhm.
really important need. And so while I want those things to happen, I am starting to ask the question, is it possible to broaden them and remove that
Yes.
gender dysphoria diagnosis so that that in of itself has hoop jumping things that are not so great
Mhm.
for trans and non-binary. You know what I mean? So just like, can we shift it to everyone gets this benefit based on need?
Yes. Oh, that is
So,
absolutely where we need to move to. And you know, I have this conversation with some of my friends
mm,
who don't have children, and
mm,
they will say the benefits are not inclusive to me. And I
mm,
go, tell me more. Obviously, you want to like understand where they're coming from.
yeah,
But if we're being really honest, I think our benefit system, and anyone can challenge me on this or help
sure.
educate me more. From my observation and the work that I've done in the space, it really is kind of they were created for um, that nuclear family,
Mm,
that idea of a mom and a dad and
yeah,
two kids and a white picket fence and all of that conversation.
yeah,
And there's so much more beyond that very singular definition.
mhm,
And, people aren't getting married
mm,
um, as much as they used to. They're choosing not to have children.
yep,
And so should they be excluded from this? And I
mm,
guess I'm sharing this story because I know this also to be true. Those that were making the decisions on how these systems should look just didn't have
mm,
different people sitting at the table to make
true.
those decisions.
Yep, yeah,
So they didn't know, so they couldn't, think of a better system.
sure.
But we do know now.
Yep.
We're having the conversation. So how can we make a better system?
Yeah. Let's ask again.
Mhm.
And keep
Absolutely.
updating and what else can we offer and what is missing and or who is missing, right? Like you were asking
Mhm.
at the beginning or you frequently asked as part of your work. It's
Mhm.
critical. And that it's I think people in many organizations, they just want to get done, and perhaps we don't get done, and it's actually just about continuously asking and not assuming. And maybe things steady or for a while, and then more things come to play. I mean, especially as we start to kind of add in AI into the mix, like who knows what kind of needs will emerge into the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
Mm-hmm.
kind of close the conversation.
Yes. And actually, that the fact that you bring up AI, I want to encourage folks to be curious within
Mm,
working within that system,
yeah.
because AI is created by humans.
Mm,
Humans are biased. If you have a
yep.
brain, you have a bias. It's not a bad thing. But if we aren't putting in inclusive information, if we're only putting in one image, one picture, one way
Mm,
of being, one way of thinking, then the outputs on the other side aren't going to be inclusive. And so we can
right.
start to think about in our work and in our practices, you know, a little bit of a pause. And it doesn't mean that we don't use AI. It just means
Sure.
that we're being curious to ask a few more questions and then go, hey, what about this? Could you think about it from this perspective?
Hmm.
And then I don't know, from my experience with using AI, it's pretty adaptable. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Thanks for
Right.
letting me know. We will now bring this into the work that
Right.
you were doing. Okay, great. Right. And
Mm,
so there's so many ways for us to be curious, and I think maybe that's another
mm,
element for our listeners to think about. The other example I was going to share, and I'll try to see if this will come into to focus,
yeah.
it is a little name tag that I had
Oh, nice.
made. And if I'm being honest, it's a magnet, so when I go to events I don't have to put a sticker on my
Um,
shirt that gets stuck in my hair because I have long
right.
hair and then falls off because the adhesive isn't that great. So this is just sort of one solution that works well for me. I put my pronouns on there, and I know that becomes like a really I was going to say simple entry point, but maybe not everyone feels that way.
Mhm.
But it is an entry point into the conversation of what does inclusion mean. And
Right.
when people maybe push back against that or say, well, why do I need to express my pronouns?
Mm,
It's not about you.
yeah.
It's about creating that inclusive environment. So I put it on there as a signal of safety for someone to
Mm,
be able to come and talk to me,
right.
because I'm willing and very open to share that. And I am very focused on
Mm,
trying to create those spaces because I do have trans friends and I
mm,
do have folks that I work with. I'm a board member with the Pride Center of Edmonton, and it's this
yeah.
real opportunity to understand what some of those challenges are for folks. And pronouns can be a really big deal for someone within their identity. And
Absolutely.
if we're taking that away from them, like
Yeah.
for what reason? It
Yeah.
just doesn't make sense. So I think that that's another way. And maybe the point I'm getting to is just like what it means to be an ally in this work to
Hmm.
get to that place of inclusion.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
are the
Yeah.
small acts that we can do as individuals to help
Every day.
pave that way? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And they're relatively kind of low cost. I mean, maybe the cost of a name tag for you that you've produced, but putting your own name and pronouns on writing it down, it doesn't cost anything, and does create that space for learning opportunities for those who don't understand this practice, or for those who are trans or non-binary. They can see, oh, this person understands that the kind of the rationale behind sharing pronouns for anyone, right? Who wants to, of course, always voluntary. But yeah, that's great. These are great, fantastic, everyday kind of tips. And then there's the larger systemic piece that we were able to get through. Kind of shifting to the end here of the session, I have just one final question before we close out. Is just kind of hope for the future. We began on a positive note of joy, things that bring us joy, and so I'm wondering kind of what gives you hope for the future of gender inclusion, and what are some things that give you momentum and give you lift.
Yeah. I'll share two stories. One goes back to my time at the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN and being part of the youth delegation. Now, what I mean by that, I should clarify, I wasn't part of it. I'm no longer qualified as a youth under the age of 35, but I got to
You're
hear
sweet.
them speak. Yes, I am. I try to be every single day. I got to hear these youth
Mm,
represent their countries and speak about some of the challenges that they see.
mm,
And there was for sure trans folks who
mm,
were there speaking on behalf of their countries.
mm.
And I thought, how cool that I just get to come into this space and be surrounded by different ideas and different perspectives and see this representation where we don't question what someone's pronouns are, we don't
Right.
question their identity. We are there to speak about the issue, and that is the focal point. So I just felt good being in that space. So I think I often hear people talk about, the youth, they really are embracing different expectations that they have for the world that they want to grow up in, or they
Oh
want to
yeah.
be in. So
Hmm.
that gives me a lot of hope. And
Huh.
maybe an extension of that, I think I share this at nauseum, but I do use TikTok, and I know there's challenges within doing so, and I always have to sort of question what platforms that I'm on, but I'm very clear on why I use TikTok, and I do use it to find good news stories, and I do find it as a place to hear voices that are not the same as my,
Mm,
meaning that I get to be exposed to other trans influencers. I get to be exposed to other people who are doing this very same work that I am,
mm,
hearing their perspectives, hearing their ideas, and hopefully amplifying those
right.
within my own communities that I'm a part of. And I think there is, again, challenges with social media, but I choose to use it to see that hope and be
Mm,
able to say, this amazing little story here actually can become this huge, amazing story
mm.
that we can share globally because we are so interconnected.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And if you're actively searching for those, it's a different way from passively consuming, right? You're kind of
Hmm.
steering the ship through, I'm sure, a lot of other stuff to get to kind of pinpointed, positive, empowering ways that people are sharing their messages, their experiences, and sharing that with others so that they can, benefit from that insight as well. So that's so encouraging. And you're right, the youth are definitely, I mean, they're literally our future, but also they have so much more that they're helping us reach for.
Yes.
We've brought it this far, and we'll provide, hopefully, provide, advance it a little bit more. But then they're really gonna go further, and that's exciting to see where they're headed with that. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And they are more fluid and
mm,
don't put up as many walls. And so I will share one influencer that I follow that I really appreciated, and I wish my brain was functioning a little bit faster to be able to share more, and maybe we can share some in the show notes for this
sure.
episode. But I had the opportunity to hear Alok speak
Mm,
recently in person,
yeah.
and definitely fangirled pretty hard and
Mm,
bought tickets in the front row. But I
nice.
share the work that Alok brings to this world because they have done a beautiful job,
Mm,
from my experience, taking a very tough topic. They are from the US, where this issue is very polarized around trans rights and trans identity. And what Alok brought forward is trans joy. And I know that you do
mm,
a lot of work in that space as well to really elevate good stories. But something that's so dark sometimes for people's identity, Alok brings humor to it. And I
mm,
do think that that is sometimes a gift
mhm.
to help us, bring a bit of a life to something that can feel so heavy. So I
Yeah.
really appreciated what they shared, and the way that they did that.
Yeah, absolutely. They've been able to digest a lot of pain, their own and that of the larger community, and been
Hmm.
able to, not shy away from it, but also uh, not have it squash any amount of joy and, possibility that they have, and that they can even bring in love into the mix too. I'm just like, mind blowing
Yeah.
because they exist in a very visible way that myself and others who are trans don't. And so they bear the brunt of so much
Mhm.
more uh, awfulness in the world. And so that they've been able to translate that in a very different direction tells me like not just like inner strength, but just the skill set that they have.
Mhm.
It's
Totally.
tremendous. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so definitely will more than happy to link to Alok for folks to have their own experience with that. And thank you for sharing that too, because it's important for us to uplift various artists and thinkers who are trans.
Mhm.
With that said, we'll close out here just to do a little plug of your own both website, erindavisco.com. Did I get that right?
Oh,
.ca?
it's
No,
erindavisco.ca. Yeah.
.ca. Okay. And also to plug your great podcast too, Unapologetic. And if you wanted to share a few words on what that is all about, yeah, feel free to share with our audience.
Yeah, so Unapologetic is really a space for brave and bold conversations about leadership and allowing guests to come on and really have the conversations that we may not necessarily feel that we can have every single day, and just really getting into the nuance of challenges with leadership, and also how can we celebrate a different way of leadership than maybe we've seen within our own careers.
Sweet. Oh my gosh. Well, that sounds fantastic. And encourage folks to go check that out. We'll link it in the show notes along with your website as well, in case people want to connect with you. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you for sharing time and space and your wonderful stories and insights on this very important topic of how do we kind of get beyond the boxes that we create and have more human-centered design and everyday interactions. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Bye for now.